All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. We may have a few people trickle in, a few people not here from last week, and that's fine. Last week, we talked about the problem of evil, and we came across a very interesting issue. And that is that the best answers for the problem of evil, which the problem of evil simply says that how can a all-powerful God allow evil to exist, especially if it's an all-good God? Well, the best answer for the problem of evil almost seem to rely on the fact that God is real in order to answer the problem of evil. So we kind of just found that this was a very unsatisfactory answer. And so I kind of put it this way, is that if you're already leaning towards the existence of God, answers to the problem of evil probably won't be an issue. But if you're very much leaning away from the fact that God could exist, then the problem of evil answers are going to be very unsatisfactory. So I decided to probably just go back to, let's get some good reasons for understanding that God is real. And so we're going to start there tonight. Before I do, a couple things. Last week's recording is not up. I had to spend 4 days out of town at a memorial service. So I'm about halfway through that edit, and then I will have it on my YouTube channel for anyone that missed it or wants to revisit or whatever that case may be there. And then, as usual, we are recording tonight for anyone that just needs to revisit anything like that. Next, good to have Ethan here. Ethan was actually one of my students the year that I taught apologetics at a homeschool tutorial. So we'll see how well I do and how well he does at keeping up with everything. So, all right. So that said, today we're going to go through, I've got 3 logical fallacies really quick that I want to address. The first one, this should be familiar for you. We talked about this last week, the burden of proof, okay? The burden of proof lies with the person that makes the claim. Okay, and this is very important because if you get into any kind of engagement, you want to watch for them trying to flip this around, right? You may just be talking to someone, someone else over here finds out you're a Christian, all of a sudden they're on the attack, right? But if they make a claim, the burden of proof rests with them. Now, it is natural for us to want to defend what we believe, okay? Especially like as a guy, it's like, don't come into my, we have our safe zone, the space that we protect. And if someone steps across that line, like we're ready to fight. But what we have to remember is if they're making a claim, they actually have the burden of proof, and that takes a lot of stress off of us. So we want to watch for that one. Another thing that you're going to find, especially dealing with atheists, is special pleading, okay? And this is what we like to call moving goalposts, all right? So in football, the goals don't move, right? If they did move, moving target's a lot harder to hit. So what you may find is they'll make a claim, and then you'll address the claim, and then what they'll do is they'll shift that goalpost and say, yeah, well, da-da-da-da. It's like, no, hold on. I did this. So I dealt with this once. I was talking to a girl that used to be a pretty good friend. She ended up marrying one of my best friends, and they moved away and went very pro-choice. And we were talking about this, and I locked down on a few pro-life arguments, and the next thing you know, she's arguing against IVF, is that right? Something like that. Anyway, and she's changing this topic. I was like, whoa. That's a whole other issue. Or she's saying, well, but the adoption system is broken. It's like, whoa, that's a separate issue than dealing with actual life, right? She's moving the goalpost, okay? You'll see, if you watch the news for 10 minutes, you'll probably see this fallacy. It's very, very common, especially in politics. And so the easiest way to address this is to say, hang on, you just moved the goalpost. Let's stick with this issue. Let's address this problem. And just call it right back to what it is. And then this one's one of my favorites, personal incredulity. Because you found something difficult to understand or unaware of how it works, you made it out like it's probably not true. If you've ever heard, well, you just pray to your sky daddy, that's a form of personal incredulity. They don't want to acknowledge that we believe in a creator. They don't want to acknowledge the fact that we have good scientific, mathematical, probable reasons for believing in a creator. And so what they do is they take this straw man, which we talked about last week, of what we believe and who we believe God is, and they make it out like some kind of fairy, right? So they're becoming incredulous because they don't want to deal with the actual issue. Any questions on those? Or thoughts?
I just have one problem with the burden of proof. I have been told, well, you're the Christian. Isn't this what you believe? Then I'm supposed to, but it's shifted on me, the burden of proof.
So again, this is where you can go back to the tactics. What do you mean by that? Actually, the even better one would be, that's actually not what I believe. How did you come to that conclusion?
That I'm a Christian?
No.
Like,
they know you're a Christian. Isn't this what you believe? Yes, it is, or no, it isn't. But how did you come to the conclusion that that's what I believe? Right?
Okay.
So, you're a Christian, so you must hate homosexuals. Well, I am a Christian, but how did you come to the conclusion that that's what I believe because I'm a Christian? Well, does the Bible say that they're going to hell? Well, it says that homosexuality is a sin, but it also says that adultery is a sin, and lying is a sin, and stealing is a sin. There's a lot of things that are sin, and just, even though I'm straight, that doesn't mean that I don't have tendencies that I have to fight against, and this is why the Bible talks about temperance, right? So we're denying the claim that we think that we're homophobic, like that we just absolutely hate homosexuals. We don't. We want them to be saved. Just like we want the adulterer to be saved. Just like we want the liar to be saved. Just like we want the murderer to be saved. All sin needs to be redeemed. It needs to be restored. So because someone's trying to use a specific sin as an accusation, especially when they use modern slanders terminology, simply use the question, how did you come to that conclusion? So then you get them talking, which can then come back to, oh, well, you hate gays. Well, what do you mean by hate? That variation of what do you mean by that? How did you come to the conclusion that Christians hate anyone that's against what the Bible says? So that can quickly turn around because, again, by saying, don't you believe, it's an implied statement, right? It's an implied accusation. They're doing it in the form of a question. So if you know how to work the conversation, you can easily turn that back to getting them to talk and investing in them. Okay, good question. All right, so today's topic can be phrased a few different ways. Is God real? Do we have good reason to believe in God? Or what we would call arguments for God's existence, okay? I've heard this a lot from various atheists. I have science, you have faith. I have fact, you have faith, or fiction. The implication is fiction, right? What we're going to look at today is going to show that both sides really are relying on faith, okay? So first and foremost, what we're going to present tonight is 5 different arguments for God's existence, and this is what's called an accumulative case. The effectiveness of the following arguments are based on the situations in which you use them. It's just kind of how we talked about the problem of evil. Different people are going to have different issues, so you need to kind of have a well-rounded ability to address these. But if we start at what I try to do is order these in such a way that you have a starting point, like if you were starting from just absolute zero, to start here and build it up. So, and we talked last week a little bit about moving not from atheism to Christianity, but from atheism to theism to Christianity, right? It's a lot easier to break this up and go in steps. So, it is necessary to start on some foundational principles and facts. The following arguments have been ordered in order to build from basic need of a divine deity toward what one should expect to find when one examines that deity. The first 2 arguments direct us to a generic God, okay? The third lays the foundation for some attributes of that God, and the last 2 begin to direct us. They won't bring us all the way in, but they will direct us towards what we believe is the biblical God, okay? That makes sense? Trying to keep it somewhat generic here so that we understand we're not really, none of these are definitively going to push someone, except for maybe the last one, to Christianity. That said, this is my personal philosophy, all right? If you disagree with this, I have no issues with it, but I do not believe that mankind will ever be able to conclusively prove or disprove the existence of God, and here's why. To prove the existence of God would remove the element of faith. And Hebrews 11:6 says, "Now without faith it is impossible to please God, for the one who draws near to him must believe that he exists and rewards those who seek him." Okay? So I believe there's always going to be that element that says you have to choose to believe this. You have to rely on some form of faith rather than actual hard, like this is made of metal. Like, there's no question about that, right? I don't think we're ever going to come that conclusively to the fact that God exists. That said, I think by putting these 5 arguments together, we're going to get really, really close. Now, in order to disprove the existence of God, and I did not originate this one must become omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent to show that God is not in any of those regions. So you would literally have to become omnipresent to prove that God is nowhere, right? And in so doing, you would become that which you seek to disprove. So in order to disprove conclusively the existence of God, you basically have to become the definition of God. And therefore, it would become a self-defeating problem. Now, Belief in God through logic, science, and statistics should be done as an accumulative case. Our belief is strongest when we understand multiple arguments for God's existence that work together to create a rope or net for our beliefs. As Ecclesiastes 4:12 says, and if someone overpowers one person, two can resist him. That's supposed to be a threefold cord, or a cord of three strands is not easily broken, okay? So by combining multiple arguments, we're going to see that there's holes in each argument, but we'll find that certain arguments actually address the holes in a different argument. That said, I want to start with a few scripture passages, okay? Psalm 19, 1-4. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky proclaims the work of his hands. Day after day they pour out speech. Night after night they communicate knowledge. There is no speech, there are no words, their voice is not heard. Their message has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. You two will be familiar with this passage, Acts 14, 15-17. Men, why are you doing these things? We are men also with the same nature as you, and we are proclaiming good news to you that you should turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and everything in them. In past generations he allowed all the nations to go their own way, although he did not leave himself without a witness, since he did what is good by giving you rain from heaven and fruitful seasons and satisfying your hearts with food and happiness. And then lastly, Romans 1, 18-20. For God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all godlessness and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Since what can be known about God is evident among them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what he has made. As a result, people are without excuse. So what these are all getting at is that God's creation speaks to his existence. And that through the study of creation and through the laws of nature, the laws of science and things like that, we can come to a good reason to believe in God, that he is not without a witness, even to those who've never heard the name of Christ. All right? Now, we're going to start with a few scientific laws. So these are things that science has said, these are fact. They're as close to being proven without exception as can be. This one is taught typically in 5th to 8th grade. It's called the law of the conservation of mass. Matter cannot be created or destroyed. Simply put, the scientific law states that in a closed system, the total mass of the system remains constant, meaning the amount of matter stays the same even during chemical reactions or physical changes, okay? If someone's cremated, they don't lose mass. That mass is just transformed into something else, okay? It's the equivalent of what that's trying to say. Next, we have 2 of the 3 laws of thermodynamics. These are, again, typically taught in elementary school. Law number 1 is kind of a parallel to the law of conservation of mass. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred. And the second law, any system left to itself will naturally tend towards increased entropy, meaning it will move towards a more disordered state of time over time, okay? And then lastly, before we dive into some of these arguments, we have what I'm going to call scientific consensus. This is not scientific law, but most scientists do in fact agree on these 2 things. The universe began to exist. We do not live in an eternal universe. Second, this universe is fine-tuned either for life or for the building blocks and environments that life requires, okay? So with these 5 statements, the 3 laws and these 2 consensuses, we're going to start there, and we're going to build our case for the existence of God. The first argument that I would like to point to is called the teleological argument, okay? Now, I have actually spoken to an atheist who said he believes this is the strongest argument for God's existence, and he said the only thing that this one really doesn't address for him is the problem of evil. And there's a very simple answer to that, and that is that this argument isn't meant to address the problem of evil, and it's not meant to bring you to the Christian God. It just simply points out the issues with an atheistic worldview, okay? So, this argument goes something like this. Complexity implies purpose. The complexity of the natural world, such as the human eye and visual cortex, implies that it was designed for a purpose. No human could have created it. The complexity of the natural world is so great that it could not have been created by humans, so it must have been created by something greater. Therefore, God is the designer. The designer of the natural world can only be God. Okay? One really good example of this is oxygen, okay? So Oxygen in our atmosphere sits at around 21%, right? If that oxygen level were to be 19%, humanity would suffocate. If that oxygen level were to increase to 23 to 25%, our atmosphere would spontaneously combust, all right? It's a very delicate balance. Now, if for just 6 of these teleological facts to be true solely by chance is considered extremely low and bordering on impossible. There have been found to be over 20 of these facts in existence, okay? The odds, according to NASA, the odds of being alive right now are 1 in 400 quadrillion. I do not remember where I got that source because I used it in a lesson several weeks ago. But then actually, according to NASA, the odds of civilizations developing on a habitable planet, so that means your Earth is here regardless. So the odds of life developing on its own are 1 in 10 billion trillion. So I want to show you what these numbers look like, all right? So the first one is 1 in 400,000 million, billion, trillion, quadrillion, all right? That's the odds of being alive right now, by chance. The other number I don't think I can actually write, but I'm going to try. So it is 1 in 10. We got 10,000 million, billion, and then another 1,000 million, billion, trillion. That's the odds of life developing on Earth by chance. So if you're thinking there's a chance, I would recommend you watch Dumb and Dumber, all right? Okay? Because that's what it sounds like when an atheist says, there's no evidence for God. I'm like, look at the math. Math alone dictates that it is absolutely, positively foolish and unscientific to believe that we came around by chance. There has to be something that made us. Now again, that's not an argument for the Christian God. That's just an argument to say that there has to be something out there that created everything we see, okay? The second argument is the fine-tuning argument, okay? So again, scientific consensus is that our world has been fine-tuned for either life or at least the building blocks of life. Premise number 1, the universe's physical constants and initial conditions are finely tuned for life to exist. Good. This is due to either necessity, chance, or design. Okay, those are the 3 possibilities. If you think of a fourth one, let me know. Number 3, it was not due to necessity or chance. Conclusion, therefore, the fine-tuning of the universe is the work of a designer. Now, there are a couple potential holes in this. First, what we call the multiverse theory, that we are one of millions of universes and ours is the one that landed on a chance for life. All right, we've got a great answer for this though. Even if this were true, the amount of universes that would have to be in place is beyond comprehension, and the math would require that no duplicates could be found. For instance, a single die can only show one side. If this die were thrown 6 times, it could come up once with all rolls being the same digit. It could come up with numbers in sequential order, so like 1 through 6 or 6 through 1, or it could come up with all 6 digits displayed in random orders, or there could be any number of patterns involving repeated digits. Should this die be able to reproduce, okay, so the present basics of multiverse theory is that for every choice, it creates a parallel world, right? So right now I have the choice to lift my left hand, my right hand, both hands or no hands. So whatever choice I make potentially could create 4 possible worlds. So with the single cast of a die, we now can assume 6 possible worlds. The chances of duplicate worlds drastically diminishes or disappears. And even if I think the theory actually holds that there can be no duplicates, which is basic probability when you're dealing with the math. However, even in a multiverse where duplicate worlds are impossible, the chances of life are greater than 1 in 10 billion trillion, according to NASA. So the math of this theory all but demands that all possible worlds must exist in order for our single one to exist outside of chance. Okay, so we already know the math for chance is bad. So this brings us to the question of necessity, okay? Premise 3 is not necessarily true, which is that necessity and chance are false. and must first be proven. So while this is technically true, the math behind the chance is astronomical, as shown by the teleological argument, and there's no reason to think that life is inherently necessary, and studies thus far show not only no reason for the necessity of life, but not even a hint of a reason for the necessity of life. Thus, the most statistical reason for a fine-tuned universe is our conclusion that there is a designer. When we look at the math, when we look at the logic, the chances of everything coming into being without someone putting this in place is astronomically low. And the chances that we who hold to a creator are right are drastically high. Any questions on these two? All right. Because what these do then is beg the question, what should we be able to know about this creator? Which brings us to the Kalam cosmological argument. The Kalam simply states, anything that began to exist has a maker, okay? We know that our universe began to exist, that's scientific consensus. Atheists and theists agree on that. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe had a maker. Now again, you might get the whole multiverse theory that says that, well, our world was just born from a previous world that was born from a previous world. But then you have to ask, who made the previous world? Matter cannot come from nothing without something that has the power to make that matter. So then, as we're beginning to ask, what kind of designer are we looking for? The first thing that we'll see through these arguments is that we have to have something or someone that is self-existent. Okay, I probably spelled that wrong. I'm not my wife's the English major. Okay, because why? Because in order for something to come from nothing, you have to have someone that can have made that. There has to be an eternal origin. Secondly, what you're going to find is that this someone is immensely powerful. Again, I'm going to misspell that one. Don't tell my wife. Okay? I'm so glad you don't go to Apex, because you'd be telling me on Monday, wouldn't you?
Taking a picture.
All right,
It's
so
gonna be up on your YouTube channel.
she doesn't watch that. So what we can see, okay, this must be pre-existent to the universe, and the creator has to be immensely powerful because he has to be able to create matter. Okay, there's nothing at this point to convert from. There's no energy out there. All of this points to something that is self-existent, pre-existent, and immensely, immensely powerful. So the most common objections that you'll typically hear, I mentioned the multiverse theory, but simple response to that, where did the original universe come from? There has to be an origin point. And then second, someone will ask, then who made God? If God is the maker, who made God? And this is a simple logical fallacy, because if God is the origin, then he doesn't need a maker. Science shows that our universe is not eternal and it had a beginning. There must be an origin point for all created things, so you need something that is uncreated, that has the power to create. Everyone's seeing how this is kind of not just moving us, first two arguments moved us hopefully from atheist toward there's something out there. But now we're slowly moving toward a biblical view of who God is. Something can't come from nothing. There must be a point of origin for all things. The primary purpose of the Kalam is to show that it is absolutely philosophically and scientifically logical to believe in an eternal source for all matter. Okay? So the Kalam is not going to get you the teleological stuff. There are some people that try to rely on it. William Lane Craig loves this argument. I think you kind of need the teleological argument, the fine-tuning argument first, and then you can come to the Kalam. All right? I think it's kind of like the cherry on top. You want to build your cake? This is the frosting. Okay? And next, I know we did this one in class, the ontological argument. So now we're getting into some arguments that are going to really start to point us toward the Christian God. All right? And ontology just simply means the nature of being, right? I am ontologically made of flesh and bone and water and chemicals, all right? So it is possible, one, that a maximally great being exists. So maximally great being the greatest thing that you can imagine. If it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. If a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. If a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. Therefore, a maximally great being exists. Say that 5 times really fast, okay? The premise of this being, if you can imagine something greater than God, then that's not God, okay? If a maximally great being can exist in, like, let's take the multiverse theory, in some possible world, some possible universe, but not in ours, well, then you can imagine one that's greater because he can exist there and here. Therefore, he should exist everywhere, okay? Now, there are several potential issues with this argument. So bear with me, I know this is really small. I actually had to split this into multiple slides. So the logical issue is that the argument treats existence as a logical predicate, which is incorrect. I guess this is the philosopher Kant famously argued that existence is not a predicate and therefore cannot be part of a concept of something. So clarification on that, basically what they're trying to say is that essence cannot include existence, okay? So consider Anselm's argument. Anselm was one of the church fathers who really put forth this argument way back in like the early years of Christianity. Premise 1, God is that then which nothing greater can be thought, so a maximally great being. The greatest thing must exist or it is not the greatest thing. Conclusion, God exists. Compare this to the perfect number is a number who has no greater number. The perfect number must exist, or it is not the perfect number, hence, a greatest number exists. Here it becomes obvious that the error in the argument is, even if we accept the existence of perfection is necessary for it to be perfect, perfection can still just as well simply not exist. So if existence is a part of essence, that does not mean that the most complete essence exists. It only says if it doesn't exist, it is not the most complete essence. So all you say is that if the most complete essence doesn't exist, then it doesn't exist. But if it exists, then it exists. And we can agree on that. This is actually from a forum where someone was going against this argument. And this is why I said there's holes in arguments, right? This is actually a very good hole in this argument. But we've established through the previous arguments that it is logically probable that a creator exists and that creator must be self-existent and eternal and uncreated, and it must be immensely powerful. So we're not relying on the ontological argument to prove God's existence. But what we're doing is we're talking about the nature of who that creator is. And the ontological argument is powerful. So if you can get to the point of saying, well, something's out there, this is very powerful to say what the nature of that being must be. The next potential hole is what we call defining God. Some argue that the argument assumes that humans have the correct concept of God, which is not possible. Thomas Aquinas, another theologian, argued that humans cannot know God's nature. The answer to this objection is flawed, as we do not know that it is not possible to have the correct concept of God, okay? There's nothing in the Bible or anywhere that we know of or any logical reason to say that we cannot know the nature of God. All right, at least not in part. Scripture tells us that there are things that we can know about the nature of God. If this world has a creator, then it would be logical to assume that the creator may put ways in his creation to be known, kind of like a map. And what do we see from Scripture? God left himself a witness. Based on the Kalam and certain scientific principles, it can be logically deduced that an unmoved mover or an uncreated creator may in fact be a necessity for the world that we see and live in. The burden of proof. The argument does not meet the burden of proof of establishing the existence of a supernatural deity with reason and evidence. Answer, the Kalam fine-tuning and teleological arguments for the necessity of something outside our universe with reason and evidence. Therefore, the ontological argument argues for what the nature of that being must be. It doesn't actually argue for the existence of God, but rather for the nature of God. Absurd consequences. This one's funny to me. Some argue that the argument would lead to absurd consequences. For example, Ganilo objected that the being that is, that than which nothing greater can be thought, cannot even be understood. Well, I think that's actually pretty good. This is not an absurd consequence. Why should we think that we can understand God in his fullness? Rather, we can understand certain things that have been revealed to us. Just as I may hide aspects of myself from someone, God can, and according to Scripture, does not reveal certain aspects of his nature. It may even be logical to conclude that we could not behold the fullness of God and survive. This is the position of Scripture, and even most pagan religions hold to a similar concept. For instance, the Greek pantheon were all created beings whose true form was not beholdable to mortals. The Greeks did not believe that their gods were pre-existence. They were all born from titans, but yet they held that they had such a glory that in their true form, humans would literally burn up in their presence. So why should we think that an uncreated God would be any different? Why do we think we have to be able to know everything about God? This simply says that God is so great, he's probably beyond comprehension, but we can know certain things. Any questions on that? Moving really fast tonight. Y'all are quiet.
You're talking really fast.
Sorry. Is all this helping? Like, do I need to go back on anything? Because that was argument number 4, and I've only got 5 tonight, so. The last one, natural law or the moral argument. And this one almost does stand on its own. And I know a youth pastor who has actually worked with 2 or 3 people, and he's used this, and just this argument was the linchpin. And we're actually going to see a quote from C.S. Lewis. This was the one that got him. Okay? This is what caused him in his studies to go from an atheist to a theist. And that simply says this: if objective moral laws exist, then there must be an objective moral lawgiver. Premise 2, objective moral laws do in fact exist. Therefore, there must be a lawgiver, and that lawgiver is God. Now, does everyone understand the concept of subjective versus objective? Okay, I'll give you an example. I was talking to somebody, Zach is actually in our class. He made a statement. We were at a class party, just a Connect group party, and he said that Costco was objectively better than Sam's. So my ears perked up because I heard the word objective. And objective means by some standard beyond our own subjectivity, right? When you hear someone say my truth, that's subjectivity. That means it's their perspective on the truth. It doesn't mean that they have their own truth, okay? There is not your own truth. You're not, as I think it's Ben Shapiro always says, you're not entitled to your own set of facts, okay? Now, there are various different perspectives on facts, all right? There's an old tale that talked about 3 blind men that walked up to an elephant. The first one felt his trunk and described that the elephant must look like a snake. The second one felt the elephant's back leg and decided that an elephant must look like a great stone pillar. The third one, blind man, felt the elephant's tail and thought that an elephant was equivalent to a feather duster, okay? They all had perspectives on the fact, but not all of them had the full picture. So objectivity is the full picture. If you've ever been in an argument, you said, hey, let's get a third party. Let's get someone, a fresh perspective, okay? Somebody outside. That's the whole point of a judge, right? The judge is supposed to be someone who is outside, who is arbitrating, whether it be a civil lawsuit or an actual crime. He's supposed to be outside the actual case. You're entitled to a jury of your peers, but those juries cannot be with bias. So you can't have a juror that is the cousin of the person you murdered, okay? That removes objectivity. So objective moral laws would be things that every person, not without fail, but that the majority of humanity believes are right or wrong, okay? Quick example. Who here believes the Holocaust was wrong? Okay. If objective moral values don't exist, then a certain mustached dictator was not wrong in what he did. Right? I mean, if we cannot say that there was some objective law that said that he was wrong, then he was not wrong, period. So, as a whole, the world in general holds to certain values. Now, there are obviously always people that disagree with that, and we'll come to some of that. Typical responses: but I'm a moral person and I don't believe in God. Are you saying that atheists can't be moral? The moral argument has nothing to do with belief in God. No proponent of the moral argument has ever argued that an individual cannot be moral unless they hold belief in God. Rather, the argument deals with grounding or substantiating objective morality. If God does not exist, then there can be no basis for objective morality. If there's no one to have given the law and to judge of that law, where does it come from? Why do we see it across all these societies that there are certain standards that are consistent? Where would that come from if not from an objective law giver?
The argument is my parents taught me, their parents taught them, their parents taught them.
Okay,
Been
so let's go back to the law of thermodynamics. Any system left to itself tends toward entropy, toward decay and disorder. Let's say we all go back to one man millions of years ago, and that man trained his children that certain values, and those values got passed on, and those values got passed on. At some point, there may be a few people that hold to those values, but if we know anything about the last 5 decades, values have changed and been dropped and shifted. Why should we logically conclude that without someone putting this law into the heart of mankind, that these greater values would increase, especially when most of those laws work against survival of the fittest? Laws like protecting the young, laws like treating the weaker and protecting them, laws and systems like elevating the spouse, the wife of the home, taking care of the birth giver. Those are things that are universal in almost every society. Now, there are random tribes, right? And one example that I saw when I was putting my notes together actually said that tribes that commit, I think the term is like euthanasia, right? They kill off the old. Well, actually, if you study the reasoning behind it, most of those pagan tribes that did that believed that you entered the afterlife in the body you died in. So they wanted them to enter eternity in a healthy body. So when they started to get old and have all the creaks and back pains, they're like, all right, we're just going to send you on in a healthy way. So it was done out of respect for the elder, just like we in the West would say, hey, we're not going to kill the elderly, right? So we actually see some common motivation, even though the outcome is different. Thoughts?
What about the people who would say that we would just know not to kill people, or we would just know not to steal, rather than it just being given to us, we would just know.
Okay,
We
but
just
again,
would be born just knowing.
if we would just know it, why did Hitler do what he did? Why do we see all of these other atrocities? Why is abortion the way of America and most of Europe? It is killing. We wouldn't just know it. What we see is that it is consistent across societies that we do know it, but it has to be grounded from somewhere. So without that grounding, we have no real reason to hold to it. So the most consistent atheist is an anarchist and probably a psychopath. But they're not. I've met many atheists that are very good moral people, and they don't want to be psychopaths and murderers. But they don't have a reason that can ground them in that belief. So then the question becomes, what if you needed to lie in order to save someone's life? It seems that morality is not absolute, as you say it is. Well, we're not actually talking about, and by the way, the objections for this one, I actually pulled this whole thing from an example article on Cross-Examined. So that is in there. If you subscribe to the notes, you can read that whole thing, although most of it's in here. We're not actually talking about absolute morality here. There is an important difference between absolute and objective. Absolutism requires that something will or must always be the case. Objectivity means that mind independent or judgment independent. When I argue for objective morality, I'm not arguing that it is always the case that lying or killing are wrong. The moral argument does not defend absolute morality, rather it contends that there is a standard of morality that transcends human opinions, judgments, biases, and proclivities. Okay, examples. Scripture does say that murder is wrong, but we also see that Scripture says that it's okay to go to war. We also see that Scripture says to punish the murderer. We see that in history, people like Corrie ten Boom were faced with an option of being a party to murder or lying. Okay? That doesn't mean that what she did was wrong by she lied to save a life. The moral argument is not here to say, well, she shouldn't have done either or something like that. It's just saying that we can look at her situation and say, she did not have a good choice. And we're going to come to the definition of how we can see this. C.S. Lewis handles it a lot better than I am right now. So we're just going to keep trucking through here. The next objection you might hear is, where's your evidence for objective morality? I won't believe in anything unless I have evidence for it. In that case, you shouldn't believe that I exist. You shouldn't believe that your parents gave birth to you. You shouldn't believe that I might have been there, but I really don't remember being given birth to. So you shouldn't believe that your closest loved ones are real, actual persons who matter and have feelings. You shouldn't believe that the external world around you is actually there. After all, how do you know that you are not a brain in a vat being electrically stimulated by a crazy scientist who wants you to think that all of this is real? You could be in the Matrix for all you know. Take the blue pill. How do you know that you weren't created a couple minutes ago and implanted with memories of your entire past life? How could you possibly prove otherwise? I actually used to mess with that last one in my head. I was like, I don't remember, obviously wasn't around for my parents dating and all that. Like, how do I know that everything that happened happens? Like, what if this is all fake? Who's ever seen The Truman Show or heard of it, right? He thought it was real, but his life was completely sectioned off as a TV show, okay? And that's basically what the answer to this objection is like, if you're only going to go by what you can prove, there is so much that even seems real that should be questioned. So, if you can see where this is going, denying the existence of something on the basis of, I will not believe unless I have evidence for it, leaves you with solipsism. We believe in the reality of the external world on the basis of our experience of the external world, and we are justified in believing that the external world is real unless we had good evidence to think otherwise, right? So we don't believe we are in the Matrix because we don't see all like a bunch of weird glitches and stuff like that. We haven't had a weird visit from a guy in a trench coat, and we believe it's a real world. There is no way to prove empirically or otherwise that the external world is real or that the past wasn't created 2 minutes ago with the appearance of age, and yet we all believe these to be true and are justified in doing so. In the absence of defeating evidence, we are justified in trusting our experience of the external world in the same way. I think we can know that objective morality exists on the basis of our moral experience. We have access to moral facts about the universe through our moral intuition. Unless we have good reason to distrust our moral experience, we are justified in accepting the reality of the objective moral framework that it presents us with. Wow, these are getting really small. If morality is objective, then why do some cultures practice, I'm not going to say that around children, cannibalism, infanticide, and other atrocities which we in the West deem unacceptable? And there's a couple of responses to that, and I dealt with that a little bit. Like, even if we look at how they're vastly different and even grotesque, a lot of times we'll see similar morals behind it, similar reasons for why they do that. Like I said, the caring for the elderly, they just believe it's better to take care of their death sooner so that they enter the afterlife healthy. And then the last one, but God carried out many atrocities in the Old Testament. He ordered the genocide of the Canaanites. For starters, this isn't really an objection to the moral argument. It does not attack either premise of the argument, and it is irrelevant. But let's entertain the objection for a second. And this is really the big answer and what brought C.S. Lewis around. By making a judgment on God's actions and deeming them immoral, the objector is appealing to a standard of morality that holds true outside of him or herself and transcends barriers of culture, context, time, period, and social norms, right? If we're going to judge God for what he did 4,000 years ago in the Middle East to a pagan, godless culture, then we're obviously appealing to some kind of morality that is beyond me. By doing this, he or she affirms the existence of objective morality, and if the skeptic wants to confirm objective morality after throwing God out the window, then there needs to be an alternate explanation for its basis. If not God, then what is it? The burden is now, and this is where you get that burden of proof shifting, right? The burden is now on the skeptic to provide a naturalistic explanation for the objective moral framework. They have to provide a way for it to exist within naturalism. And that brings me to this quote. This is from the book that's up here, Mere Christianity. Mere Christianity is divided into like 5 mini books that are like 5 or 6 chapters each. So this comes from book 2, chapter 1. That section, and that chapter is called The Rival Conceptions of God. My argument, and this is C.S. Lewis testifying here, my argument against God is that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such a violent reaction against it? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own, but if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my fancies. Sorry, he's British. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out what it. We should have never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there were no light in the universe and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never have known it was dark. Dark would be without meaning. The very fact that we have a concept of right and wrong means that there must be something to tell us what right looks like. If we don't know, as he said, what a straight stick looks like, how can we tell if something is crooked? And he goes into a lot more detail of this in the book, but he talks about the same person who says that there's no morality will get upset when you break a contract. Same person who says, well, it's okay for me to do this, because they start doing a moving goalpost. See, you need to tell the truth, but I can lie to you, well, because I have extenuating circumstances. They're not justifying that lying is okay, they're justifying their reason to break a rule. And that for C.S. Lewis was the turning point, to say there has to be something greater than myself out in the universe. There has to be something objective in order for this all to be right. And it can't just boil down to culture. It can't boil down to being raised. This has to be something that is carrying this standard across eons and generations upon generations upon generations. Again, I highly recommend Mere Christianity. He does a lot better job than I can at explaining this. But all of that said, what we've tried to do tonight is build a foundation of, we can trust science, we trust mathematics, we've got certain principles of logic. Using those, we find good, solid reasons to believe in some form of a creator, some form of deity. By looking at what we should expect based on those principles, we have found a God who is self-sustaining, self-originating, has the power to create matter and energy and do that which is impossible inside our universe, something outside our universe that could start all of this. And we have seen that being is also likely the giver of an objective moral value that we experience. And so we have witness inside through nature, through morals, through scientific laws and principles for the evidence that God is real. And if you can move someone from the point of believing God isn't real closer to the point of God is real, then we can address that whole, well, what about evil? And I think we dealt with some pretty good examples last week through the free will theodicy, through the soul building concept, through shared experience, all of these things. And many of them are even found in scripture. I was reading, I don't remember what passage it was, but it actually, you mentioned the soul building theodicy, and there's a problem with people that mankind will be going through things to develop, that God puts us through the pressures of life to grow us and to shape us, that this world is kind of a gymnasium for us to develop our spiritual bodies. So once we move from atheism to theism, then we can begin to address the problem of evil. Any questions or thoughts? All right. Last week I was asked for a reading list. So these books, some of them deal with a lot more than this topic, but these are all ones that really do deal with specifics on trusting the reality of God. Mere Christianity, of course, by C.S. Lewis, I quoted tonight. On Guard by William Lane Craig. He goes through several of those arguments and the philosophies behind them, different things. Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel. He's got a whole series of Case of. It started with the Case for Christ, and I don't remember which one came next, if it was Creator or Case for Heaven. He's got several of them. I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norman Geisler and Frank Turek. I think by looking at the numbers tonight, you can truly see that someone who holds to naturalism has to have a lot of faith, or a lot of Jim Carrey. Next, I mentioned this one last week, Letters from a Skeptic by Greg Boyd and Edward Boyd. Some of the arguments that we presented tonight, so Greg is an apologist. His father was 70 years old and an atheist, and through a letter writing campaign over the course of 3 years, they ended up, Edward became a Christian, and then they published those back and forth conversations. And so one of the first things that he did, his dad brought up the problem of evil, and so Greg kind of backtracked. He said, well, let's just start with the logic for God. Let's get here and determine this aspect, that God is real, that there has to be something, then we can deal with that. And kind of took the approach we're talking about tonight. So the first part, few letters of that book deal with just moving him from a skeptic to a theist. Core Facts by Braxton Hunter, phenomenal book, very easy to read. The first half of that book, so the way he broke this book up is it's in 2 parts. Each part's divided into 2 sections, and it's an acronym. And I don't remember what it all stands for, but the word core is basically arguments for God's existence. The part for facts is evidences for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That is really what brings people to Christianity, okay? If you can get them to being a theist, the proofs of the resurrection are really the proof for our God. And then the second half of the book is he deals with common objections to each one of those arguments. And then lastly, this is a book Pastor Chesser actually mentioned 2 to 3 months ago. If you can find it, please let me know. The only place I can find it is on Thrift Books, and it is not in print anymore. It's like $100 on there. That said, if you like e-reading, I did find a free PDF of it that you can read online, and I started that this afternoon. But this book deals again with the science behind the existence of God and the proofs of the Bible, different things like that. One of the things that I loved in that is he talked about the math that we presented tonight. And this is the part that Pastor quoted in his sermon. He said, the probability of life developing by chance is equivalent to a man piling the state of Texas 2 feet high with silver dollars. He then takes a single coin, colors it black on one side, and throws it into a random spot in Texas, blindfolds himself, flies over Texas in a helicopter, and picks up that coin on the first try. That is the odds, the proven mathematical odds of life existing by chance. You tell me who has faith and who has reason, the atheist or the theist. I think based on the math, based on the logic, we have the better stance. We have the more probable stance. And I think it would be hard to prove otherwise. Did we arrive at a conclusiveness that God exists? No. Because without faith, it's impossible to please him. But I think we're about as sure as we can get without it. At least I hope you are. I know these were the ones that really convinced me. So these are some great sources. Again, if you're into podcasting, these are some terrific podcasts or YouTube channels. Also, highly recommend William Lane Craig's On Guard is a good one, especially for dealing with these topics. There's a few debate channels I could probably recommend too. If you're looking for more of the what we call in-house discussions, there's a few other podcasts, but a lot of these guys deal, especially Mama Bear Apologetics, The Church Split, Bible Thinker, and Trinity Radio. They really do deal with the atheistic side of things very, very well. In fact, so Trinity Radio, Braxton Hunter, who wrote Core Facts, he's one of the hosts. Will Hess, who's a friend of mine, is the host of The Church Split. He's the youth pastor I mentioned that